Hello and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know, we are carrying a series on gender studies, and in previous sessions we have discussed a lot on various issues. Today also we would be talking on gender studies, and our topic of discussion is gender and politics. For this very discussion, dear friends, we have with us in our studios Dr. Archana Prasad. Dr. Archana Prasad is Assistant Professor in Department of Sociology, Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. So let's welcome Dr. Archana Prasad and let's try to understand what is the relationship between the gender and politics, and how politics plays important role when we talk about the gender specifically. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Gitika. Welcome once again to the gender series lecture, and today I have to talk on a very interesting topic. Interesting also in the sense that we are in a very important time and we see so much of political changes taking place in and around us. In terms of the elections, presidential elections that took place in US, where we saw a female candidate losing to a male candidate, and then we have the recent elections in Uttar Pradesh where we see the BJP winning with a very good margin. And therefore, when politics has become so important, does it not important to understand that what is the role of women in politics and how politics can be used to empower gender equality. It is also a time when identity has become very important, because the whole issue of belongingness has become crucial, and that becomes very significant to understand the sense of belonging women to a country, to a state, to a region, where it is very significant that her contributions becomes important. In today's lecture, I'll be talking in two parts. The first part, I will be briefly introducing to the whole contribution of feminist understanding to gender and understanding of politics. That is how the domain of politics, which was once assumed to be a male domain, began to be influenced by feminist research, by women activism, and slowly and steadily we see a certain kind of change taking place in society. But then it is very important to keep in mind that though changes are visible, though there is a shift from certain kind of invisibility, from certain kind of marginalization, where there was very insignificant presence of women, to women becoming presidents and prime minister and taking hold in cabinets and parliaments. But then there are a large number of gaps, there are a large number of paradoxes which needs to be understood, and India would be the best society to understand the paradoxical situation. So in the second half, we'll see how has the progress of both gender and politics taken place in the context of Indian society. To begin with, let us try to understand what is the significance. Why do we need to understand politics and gender? And that is politics as a real world phenomena and political science and an academic discipline. So most of the time it is an assumption that politics belongs to the domain of political science, and therefore to understand gender, it needs to be understood from both the sides. The real world, which is the actual taking place of elections, where parties are contesting elections, governments are formed, and also how these conceptualizations of politics is taking place in the discipline of political science. And we see that in both there is a certain kind of gender bias. People all over the world find that basic conditions of their life, their safety, health, education, work, as well as access to public spaces are fundamentally shaped by identification as belonging to particular sex or gender group. And that is very important to understand the whole understanding of politics, because politics is power. So the whole idea of those who have and those who don't have is a relation between the powerful and the powerless. So whether you have access to resources or you don't have access to resources is again determined by the political domain. Until recent time, women's issues and interests concern had been excluded from the political arena for two basic reasons. One was the whole understanding between the private and public sphere. And this takes me back to the whole conceptualization of gender. And we see that the whole gender norms are constructed on the dichotomy between public and private. That is to say that public belongs to men and private belongs to women. And there was a clear-cut division of labor, that all tasks associated in the private realm are the responsibility of women, and everything that is happening in the public, it belongs to men. Following from this assumption appeared that since politics belongs to the public domain, women had no role to play, and therefore they were kind of excluded from political participation, or there was completely a kind of invisibility. The number of voters, the number of women candidates in the 19th century was minimal. So the whole we see a linkage between where it is flowing from the dichotomy between private and public. In the previous lectures on trying to conceptualize feminist theories, I have already said that the feminists have questioned this dichotomy. In order to have gender equality, the first task for the feminist is to question that the division between public and private, because they say that there is nothing which is so public and there is nothing which is private, and there is a kind of a continuum from public to private. So, to understand politics, we need to break away with dichotomy between private and public. The second reason for exclusion of women from politics was the whole idea dominating in the society was the patriarchal norms and ideology. And it was the patriarchal norms and ideology which strengthened women's domestic role, women's domestic responsibility, and they were considered to be caretaker and nurturers of children and domestic space, and therefore they were not considered suitable for participating in political life. These assumptions began to be questioned since the beginning of the 20th century with the emergence of the suffragist movement, where they started questioning the right of women to vote and to participate in political life. With the large number of political activism across the world, we started seeing a little bit of shift where there was a large number of women prime ministers and presidents, especially in the South Asian countries. There is an increase in the recent election in the number of women contesting election as well of women voters, and therefore there is a kind of an understanding that the gendered biasness or gender imbalance in politics is shifting. But yet we need to keep in mind that politics in modern time is equally gendered, though it could be a different shape, it could be a different kind of genderedness, but the prevalence is still there. Although men no longer seem to vote more than women in post-industrial society, they still tend to be more active than women in other forms of political activity. That is in terms of the leadership, in terms of, again we see within politics there is a kind of distinction which takes place between the domestic and the reproductive work. And somewhere there is a kind of a presence where women would be assigned more work which could be considered as more soft or something which would be considered as more feminine in nature, and therefore the gender division of labor continues to be a part of politics. Therefore, importance to therefore how do we put in gender politics to understand the way in which political associations, political groups and political parties are functioning. And therefore, theories of gender enables us to understand the two-way relation. One, how gender influences the functioning of political institutions and organizations, and second, how political institutions process and thinking influences a change in the gender relations. So the two has to work together in an attempt to bring about a change in both the sphere of gender and politics. That is to make gender more political and to make politics more gendered. And that brings me to the whole understanding of Kate Millett's sexual politics, where she tries to say that gender relation is equally political. That is, it's a relation of power. Politics is power, and it's any kind of relation is a relation of power. And therefore, politics becomes significant not only in formal institutions and associations, but to understand the nitty-gritty of everyday life. If that brings to us to the whole conceptualization of politics. What is politics? In the very traditional way, or in the very initial ways of how politics was understood, it was concerned as the activity of government or governing. The word politics in the original Greek was used by Aristotle to connote those questions that pertain to the operation of polis or the political community. And for a very long time, this political community was considered synonymous to public, and therefore the exclusion of women from the political community. The distinctive feature of politics is its public or general nature, the way it affects the community as a whole as distinct from private matters. The traditional focus on politics as the study of the machinery of government and electoral politics or political elites and formal institutions rendered women and gender invisible. So, when we look into the understanding of politics in the traditional political science discipline, we see that it was a male domain, or it was a dominance of men. And therefore, there were statements like men are the maker of world politics, and it applied to all mainstream societies, whether it be a rural society or an industrial society. The underpinning understanding was that it is a world of men, and therefore women had no role to play. Politics is still male dominated. The global average for women in the lower house of legislation is still 20% till November 2011. In all political bodies, from the smallest rural organization to the central legislature, men predominates. Though the number has significantly increased, say from 3 to 11, but then again if you see the sex ratio in terms of the number of men and the number of women, we see the number of women is still less. Even in the US, people preferred a black man to a white woman as their president. So, it is a country which is quite dominant in terms of racism, where race is very important, the color of the skin is very significant. But then, because they did not want a female as their leader, they preferred to select a black as the president. South Asian countries known for female presidents and prime minister, but has never had in the history more than 10% of women as parliamentarians or women in parliaments. The dominant mode of functioning of all political organizations and parties is inherently patriarchal. We see with the entire women's activism, each political party, especially in the context of India, started having women wings or started increasing the number of women participant in the politics. But then the mode of functioning to a large extent was dominated by patriarchal ideology. Great Britain has the largest democracy among all European countries, but has only 6% representatives in the parliament. So, if we try to look into this understanding of both the politics in the political science and in the facts and figures, we see that it was very badly dominated by men, and therefore there was a necessity for feminists to come about and bring about a contribution in order to make it a more gendered understanding. And therefore, the first thing that feminist contributor did was to do away with the formal understanding of politics. That is, it is not necessarily that politics refers only to institutions and organization in the formal setup. And as I said already, it is something which is to do with everyday life. Everyday life is a power relation, and to understand politics, you do not necessarily understand what is happening in the parliament and what's happening in the government, but it is also significantly important to understand what's happening in everyday life, because it is the people who would ultimately elect the government, and it is the people who would decide the leader. So, there was a shift from understanding of politics as formal or institutional setup to politics of everyday life. And therefore, we see that feminists added two meanings to the understanding of politics. One, they expanded the definition to include informal politics and dynamics of everyday life. And second, power relations permeate all levels of private sphere. In that sense, there was a complete rejection of the private-public dichotomy. And as we have already heard in the previous lecture, in the second wave feminist movement, there was a call given by feminist activists, personal is political. And this becomes very significant to understand the politics in private sphere, that what is happening in your personal life is equally political and what is happening in politics is equally personal. So therefore, this completely does away with the distinction between the private and the public. And with the contribution of feminists to the understanding of politics, they came in a concept called gender politics. Gender politics is an approach to the study of politics which focuses on two things. One, the social construction of gender, that is masculinity and femininity in everyday functioning of politics as well as everyday life. And two, the role of gender in political and social life. That is to try to understand, does it make a difference if there is a women leader or if there is a men leader? Would there be a possibility that if the number of women in parliament is more, the policies and the modes of functioning would become more gender balanced? So these questions are central to the feminist understanding of politics in today's time. Now, if we look into the whole understanding of politics, from a gender perspective, three things are very significant. One is to understand the political participation, the second is representation, and the third is in terms of the electoral behavior of men and women. If we go into the first, which is the political participation, we see women's suffrage in the United States was achieved gradually at state and local levels during 19th century, culminating in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States. This is to say, going to the historical understanding is a time 20th century when women's participation in politics was recognized even in the Western countries. Across the globe, women had to active mobilize and struggle to get space for themselves in politics. So this would not be the right place to go into women's movement, but if we look into the way in which women's movement has taken place, one of the central goal or target of women's movement was to ensure greater political participation of women, not only in the Asian countries, but in all European and other Western countries as well. So we see some of the milestones which has been achieved by different countries. The right to stand for election was achieved in 1788 in US, right to vote in 1893 in New Zealand, first parliamentary was in Finland in 1907, and first women head of state was in Mongolia 1953. So we see there is a gradual shift from one place to another, and gradually the number has increased. According to the available data for 2014 by Geneva-based Interparliamentary Union, India's neighboring countries such as Pakistan has 67 women in House of 323, that is 20.7%. Bangladesh has 67 out of 347, that is 19.3%, while Nepal has 172 out of 575, which is 20.9%. So that is the reason why it is said that South Asian countries are far better in terms of the participation of women in parliament, in the government bodies, and therefore it is a significant contribution of the feminist movement to the recognition of women's role in politics. If we look into a little more facts and figures, we see there only 22.8% of all national parliamentaries were women till June 2016, and this is an increase from 11.3 to in 1995. So there is an increase, and this increase is significant. Until Jan 2017, 10 women are serving as head of state and 9 are serving as head of the government. Rwanda has the highest number of women parliamentarians worldwide. Women there have won 63.8% of seats in the lower house. Globally, there are 30 states in which women account for less than 10% of parliamentary in single or lower house, including 4 chambers with no women at all. So if we actually look into statistics and data, it's a kind of a confusing statement where where one gets the impression that the number is increasing, but then again one is stuck with the whole understanding of or a comparison of the performance of men and women, and there is a improvement in the participation rate, but yet that participation rate is completely at a lower margin. The second understanding of gender and politics is in terms of representation. Representation is to be understood in terms of three principles. First is, and this is a feminist understanding, that it is unjust that women are underrepresented. So there is no logic why women would not be represented in all decision making bodies. There is no justification for excluding women. The second, valuable human resources are wasted when half of the population is not involved in politics. So if politics is in terms of the community includes both men and women. So if you are not utilizing half the population of the community, then it is actually a waste of resources. Therefore, it is important that the community being well represented, both men and women are equally represented in any kind of political setup. In politics, women will employ different sets of values and pursue different interests for men. So there is a kind of an gendered understanding again that although there could be there are arguments which says that if women are represented in the decision making body, the chances of having a more gendered rules and regulations, policies, acts are greater. Women's struggle for equality of right has been one of the key components of global struggle for democracy. So any kind of democracy would be incomplete if women representations is not taken into account. And most important is in terms of the representation at every level of the government, and therefore the local government becomes very significant. In the context of India, we'll see that it is the Panchayati Raj where there is a representation, or there is a quota system where women are being reserved, and therefore it has brought about change both in the political functioning of society as well as the status of women. If we look into participation, we see that the number the women starts participating, it has a large impact on society. And therefore, it is a way of improving the status of women in society. It is a mode of making society more egalitarian. There is increase in the standard of living of people, and people start having a kind of a more gendered or a more balanced lifestyle, and therefore it is a step towards peacemaking. But it is a point where we see that participation is not easy. Therefore, you need certain amount of conditions in which women would be allowed to participate more frequently, and therefore it is important to change the structures of the society by which they are able to participate, and that is making access to position of power, making the system more transparent, changing cultural norms and values, improving the economic empowerment of women, the political will of state to ensure that women participate in large number, to give voice to the women in both in terms of empowerment and critical mass. Access to women in terms of resources, both material and economic resources, democratic and cultural space, information, and gender disaggregated data. So in all these through all these steps, then there is an increase in the participation of women in the politics. But when we look into the way in which women have been participating in the politics, we see there is a certain kind of imbalance, and it is very important to understand that there is a relation between gender and political parties. Political parties served as the main venue of women's participation in political politics, but most of them are hardly into leadership role. Participating in political party can help women to know their rights and to improve things for themselves and for their family. Domesticity in political parties, women are assigned tasks of clerical work and mobilizing female voters. So there is a need for representation, responsiveness of political parties. The stress should be more not in terms of only increasing the quantity of women participation, but to make it more qualitative, that women, if are participating in a political space, or if they are participating in as voters and as members of the parliament, it should be more conducive, it should be more gendered, neutral in terms of doing away with the feminine and masculine task. So in this first part of the lecture, the focus has been to bring about an interlinkage between gender and politics, to have a more comprehensive or more holistic understanding of the way in politics functions in society. So in the second part of the lecture, I will take on the more in terms of how it has been functioning in the Indian society, and look at some of the paradoxes of Indian, the way in which women and politics have been functioning since the time we got independence. Thank you. Welcome to the second part of the lecture, and it is very important to understand the situation in which gender and politics has been functioning in the Indian society. And to begin with, it is very important to understand the relation between gender and state, because we know India is a democratic welfare state where it is the responsibility of the state to take care of the women's equality. So before I go into the way in which gender and politics has functioned, let me look into the theories of gender and state, and that will help us to understand how the Indian state has been responsive to the women's equality. So we look into the feminist theory of state, we see there are different branches of feminism, which has already been taken care in the initial lecture, where we see there are three branches of feminism: the liberal, the radical and the socialist, and the three differ in the way in which they conceptualize gender relation in society. The thing which is very important to look into the liberal feminist, and as we know by the ideology of liberal feminism, they are very optimist about it. They say that the state has been historically dominated by men, it has been patriarchal in its functioning, but then there is a chance of transformative change, and then there are a possibility that women would be taken care and the concerns would be looked into it. In complete opposition to the liberal feminist, we have the radical feminist, who are pessimist in their view, and they have a very radical view of state, and which says that they are patriarchal and it will never be employed for feminist ends, and it could be kind of a illusion to believe that the state is actually more gendered. The third is a socialist feminist, which is a kind of balance between the liberal and the radical, and they see state as a mechanism of power and dominance. So it is to go into the theoretical understanding of politics, where I already said that politics implies power. So those who are in politics, it is those who are in the government, those who are representative, are participating, are obviously in a powerful relation. So there is a relation of domination and subordination. So as long as there is a relation of domination and subordination, the political strategies of state would not be very conducive to allow gender equality. So there would be certain barriers, there would be certain challenges to gender equality, and that is what would actually be seen in the context of India. Since the time India achieved independence from the constitutional guarantee of equality to all its citizens irrespective of the gender, the 73rd Amendment and the 81st Amendment of the Constitution, which guaranteed political representation of women at the local political bodies, till the debates on two very important things. One is the Reservation of Women in Parliament, and the second is the Uniform Civil Code. We see that there is a kind of paradoxical understanding, or there is a kind of a two-way, where there are certain steps, there are certain mechanisms where certain progress is being made, and that is again evident from the number of leaders, political leaders that we have, and participation, greater participation. But then it is very important to keep in mind that complete success has not been achieved, and there are still certain hurdles which has to be drawn. So when we look into the whole understanding of Indian society, we see that India, the government or the state, which is a welfare state, has from time to time made various social economic policies in order to regulate the normative gender relations. One of the policies of the welfare state is to balance the reproductive and the productive role of women, and there is where we see there are certain regulations, there are certain rules which protect motherhood and so that women continue to with their paid employment. So there is a progressive that you don't only are relegated to the domestic sphere, but certain safeguards like the Maternity Benefit Acts and other benefits which are given to women in order to pursue their public role. The Government of India has directed state and local governments to promote equality by class and gender, including equal pay and free legal aid, human conditions and maternity relief, right to work and education, and raising the standards of living. So as long as it is a welfare state, these steps have been taken care of. But as we go back to the lecture on economy and gender, we see that there is a shift from a welfare to a liberal, neoliberal state where the market starts dominating. And in the lecture, I have already argued that there is a kind of a privatization of these welfare schemes, and there is a neglect on the part of the state to actually fulfill its objective of giving equal rights to women. And there is a gender gap in terms of the wages. The number of women participating in top position is less. So the data are suggesting that state has made certain strategy, but it is not fulfilled in the true political spirit, and therefore there are certain gaps. And that comes into the whole concept of glass ceiling in politics. The phrase glass ceiling refers to an invisible barrier that prevents someone from achieving further success. In the sense that you have the provisions, you have the way forward, but then there are certain obstacles which would prevent women from reaching the top. It is often heard in the context of women who could not advance to the highest level of power in the workplace. There are certain structural barriers, there are certain cultural barriers, and there are ideological barriers that prevent or it acts as a ceiling in order to let the women move further. An invisible upper limit in corporate and other organizations above which is difficult or impossible for women to rise in the rank. It is glass because it is usually a visible barrier, but in politics we will see that there are a lot of invisible barriers as well. It is not always explicit, and that is very important to understand state. The state don't explicitly say that they are not in favor of politics, but the political will of the state ensures that the implementation does not take place, and that becomes a kind of a barrier. So we look into the voting rights of women. Did not have a voting right till the 20th century. Women in US were the first to start fighting for the rights to vote. In India, as early as 1917, raised the issue of universal adult franchise. The British government granted the right to vote on the basis of wifehood, property and education by the 1935 Government of India Act. The Constitution of India, which came into existence in 1950, granted universal adult franchise to all its citizens. So, women had the right to vote in the independent country. But when we look into the country-wise year in which women have got the voting right, we see Australia got it way back in 1902, Finland in 1906, Norway in 1913, Denmark in 1915, Soviet Russia in 1917, America in 1918, England in 1928, Italy in 1945, Switzerland in 1971 and Syria in 19... So, the basically is it's the beginning of the 20th century that women started having the right to vote. If we look into the statistics in terms of women's participation in Indian context, we see the representation of women was very low in the beginning. Women in parliament is only 11%, whereas in Belgium it is 50% and in South Africa it is 36%. So, we see the data which is only 11% in the Indian context. From 03, there were only 3 women in the parliament in the beginning, in the early 1950s. It increased to 09 and recently it has increased to 14. Women ministers are given less important political portfolios like health, welfare, local government. It was only in the BJP government that we see the women were having important crucial cabinet ministry. The number of women contesting election is again low because of the certain stereotypical or certain myths which are there. The political parties fear the fact that women will not be able to win election and therefore they are not given the ticket. But then we will see the 2014 election had dismantled the myth, and all the number of women contesting election, the victory of the women were far more than the men contesting election. The percentage of women contesting election has increased from 2.3 in 1952 to 6.5 in 1999. So, there is a increase in the percentage of women contesting election, but again to bring back is that if you look into that percentage in terms of the total women's population, it is a insignificant number. It is only 9% of the total contestant who are women. Women turnout during 2014 parliamentary general election was 65.63%. compared to 67.09%, and here we see an increase in the number of women actually contesting election, and that is the whole understanding of the scenarios which is taking place in the Indian society. We have the government policies, we have women activism and the media, internet. So there is a kind of a generation of the idea that women should not be excluded from politics, and women themselves have become conscious of the fact that it is important for them to take part in politics, and therefore we see this increase in number. India ranks 20th from bottom in terms of representation of women in parliament. So this is again very low. The gap between men and women voters, that is the gender gap in voting pattern, has narrowed down with a difference of 16.7 in 1962 to 4.4 in 2009. The state election have seen a growing trend in women's participation, and in some cases women turnout is exceeding the men, especially in large number of states in northeast and many other states in Maharashtra. We see the number of women voters is far more than the men's participation. Increased turnout of women was reported from 2012 Vidhan Sabha election, with states such as Uttar Pradesh reporting 58.82 to 60.29 turnout. In 2013 assembly election, women's overall turnout was reported to be 47.4 and male turnout was 52.5. So the gap, the gender gap has certainly narrowed down, and the difference is becoming negligible. The sex ratio of voter has improved from 715 female voters for every 1000 male voters in 1960 to 883 female voters in 2000. But yet we see that it is only 883, and it is still a requirement to see that number touches at least the 900 mark. One of the most important thing to understand politics in India is the reservation of women, especially in the local government. In 1993, India adopted a quota system for village level panchayat council. That is, certain seats were reserved, 1/3 seats were reserved for women in the local bodies. Studies have demonstrated that there is a substantial impact of reservation for women. Women villagers are more likely to report incidents of gender-based violence. So, there is an increase in consciousness of their position. Women representatives are twice likely to pursue access to and repair of water facility in villages than men, because water is women's job. So, here we see a kind of paradox, that where there is a progress, there is a kind of an improvement, but again the attachment or the linkage to domesticity is not being done, and that is a kind of a challenge, even at the local bodies, where politics has not become all of a kind of a gender neutral. Women reservation bill has been introduced in the National Parliament to reserve 33% of Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha seat for women. However, it's almost been decades that this bill is being debated, and no political party is showing its 100% commitment to ensure. And there's lot of debate, there's lot of confusion in terms of whether the bill should be passed. So it in a way suggests that though we are seeing certain kind of progress, the society is still not ready for a complete kind of shift from politics, which is a domain of men, to a kind of giving more space. It's only an increase in the number of participation of women. So even that is a fear among a large number of political parties, that it might change the power balance. So we'll look into the limitation of reservation policy. So one of the most outstanding limitation has been in terms of the actual participation, and therefore terms like proxy or terms like the fact that women were only as rubber stamps into the literature or into the understanding, where we see that women were elected as representative, but they were not actually functioning in the true spirit. It was the men their men relatives, that is the husband or the father and the brother, who were actually functioning, and they were only there as a kind of a way, because certain seats were reserved for women. It was easy for a family or a community to win the election and to have a member of their community as representative, that reservations was being used. The whole idea is that a certain kind of political change was there, but the cultural, structural, economic changes did not take place to allow women to fully participate in the political process. So women actually lacked experience and expertise. We see a high rate of illiteracy, especially in the rural areas. So women were not educated enough to understand the policies, to understand, read and write, and therefore they needed the assistance of men to function in a proper manner. The states took certain strength to ensure that this participation becomes more strong, and therefore they started putting curb on the case of proxy attendance by relatives of women. States have been advised to initiate departmental proceeding against the officers in whose presence such meetings are held. Meetings of Mahila Sabha are held prior to Gram Sabha meeting, and recommendations and decisions of Mahila Sabhas are mandatory transmitted to Gram Sabha. In the quorum of Gram Sabha, inclusion of at least half the number of women voters should be mandated. So, states which have not mandated such provisions should do so. So, there are certain again mechanism through which the whole idea is to ensure a full participation of women in politics. Panchayati Raj institutions should be involved in any integrated plan of action to prevent and combat women trafficking. Problems in disturbed area, displacement due to land acquisition, related matters may be taken up in the Mahila Sabha in case of issues of children. So, large number of strategies of mechanism has been initiated by the government to ensure that participation takes place. And again, there is a lot of debate whether women's participation would make about a difference. And there are studies which suggest that yes, participation, even though it is in a kind of a proxy, the fact that women gets elected is a kind of bringing about a change in the whole identity of the women. And being into politics, the whole lack of experience and expertise will get removed, and over a period of time, it would be a barrier only in the initial stage. After a point of time, the women would have the experience and the expertise of political issues as much as their male counterpart have. So, it should not be a kind of demerit, but more and more women should be encouraged to participate in the political process. Very interesting understanding of gender and politics in India is the relation between women and political parties, and we see that political parties have increased outreach among voters as India's party system has become more competitive. So, each party has a women wing. So, you have the Mahila Morcha of BJP, you have the Durga Vahini of VHP, Rashtriya Seva Samiti of RSS, All India Mahila Congress of Congress Party, and National Federation of India of the CPI. So, this is again an integral part of the policy of women empowerment, that to be progressive and to show that you are more gendered, you need to have a women wing. But then there could be a feminist critique to it, that you did not these political wings within the political party actually brings about a division of labor, where there is a distinction between the men political leaders and the women political, and there is a kind of a gender division of labor. Women had made their presence felt in the inner political party circles, have been relegated to the second rung of leadership, and have failed to break the glass ceiling. So, you can actually name the number of women leaders, political leaders, if you have, because India is a large democratic country. If you were to sit and name all the male political leaders, it would be a difficult task. But number of women leaders, it would be taken only 2 minutes to name them. Women are assigned the job of keeping an eye on women's issues and also mobilizing female voters. So, the way in which politics in India functions is to link politics to gender, caste, religion. So, if you have a female contestant, your vote bank is your women. If you are a Dalit leader, your vote bank are Dalit voters. So, this is a way in which Indian democratic system has been functioning, and there are certain critiques to it, but then it also has certain positive things. Indian women have also taken initiative to form their own female party or their own political party. In 2007, United Women Front Party was created and has advocated for the increase in reservation. But again, we see that it has not been able to function in the way in which some of the mainstream political parties are functioning. So, the whole understanding is to look into the controversies or look into the paradox of Indian political scenario. Since 1990, celebration of women's active role in political process, 1990 has been a significant shift, not only in terms of politics, but we also see there is a coming in of the liberalization, the opening of the economy. There is an increase in the electronic communication, in terms of the internet explosion, in terms of mass media. So, all these together has actually played a role in improving the women's participation, and 90s therefore become celebrated as a decade where women's empowerment, political empowerment could be felt. Political and social consensus for increased representation of women in politics. This consciousness or consensus was achieved universally, that it was not only in terms of one party or the Congress advocating for more women's participation, but every political party felt the need that they should actually support the increased participation of women in politics. 1996 election recorded the highest turnout of women voters, but in 1999 and 2004 there was a gender gap of 8% as far as women and more. So there is a shift and continuity. The trend is not always the same. Women have more concentrated presence in the no opinion category. That is, even though you have very important dominant political leaders, but by and large the majority of them are considered only in the no opinion category. So what are the challenges that are being faced by women political participation? The most important is the traditional division of labor. I began with the distinction between private and public, and that is the distinction. Another distinction which is very similar to it is the distinction between the productive and the reproductive. So traditionally women had been assigned the domestic work, and therefore to shift from the traditional role as mother, as caregiver to political is a kind of a challenge for the majority of the women. Illiteracy, as I already said, that majority of the women in the percentage of illiteracy rate is very high. So it becomes a kind of a barrier to actually contest election, participate and function in the democratic system. Economic barrier, because contesting election is not an easy task in Indian society. Lack of sufficient training and many other factors which keep them away from politics. Elections have become a costly affair. Women are not able to generate large amount of money required to fight election. Centralization of power and corruptions have become major obstacles for women to participate in politics. So there is a whole number of structural, cultural and ideological factors which actually are big obstacles even though the state supports the equal participation of women. One another trend which is very common in the Indian society is to see the way in which women who have been successful in politics are generally supported by the family. So that is, if you have your relatives, your husband, your father as politicians, it becomes easy for the women to contest election and win election than independent women, say a women coming from a rural area, having no awareness of the political process in which it would be difficult for the women to actually win. So, secondly, there is an absence of the political activism which takes place in large number of Western country or more European country, where there is a mobilization of women to not only cast vote but also become representative, becomes leaders, become decision maker in the process. So if we look into the electoral participation of women, it can be tried to understood in terms of layers. Women representative in the lower house and in state legislative assembly. Second is women as candidates of political parties in electoral competition and as members, functionary of political parties. Women as active campaigners and torchbearers of political parties, and women as members of electorate participating in elections. So the number of women in the first category is significantly less, and the number of women in the last category is significantly more. There is a certain kind of change in the way politics has been taken place, and as I already said, that there is an increase in the number of participation and certain myths are being dismantled. One of the myths was the women's lack of winning ability. And the 2014 election showed that women's success rate was 9% compared with 6% of men. So the whole idea that political parties were reluctant in giving tickets to women candidates became therefore was no longer a myth. So women candidates are capable of winning election as much as men. It is not a question of gender, that whether you are a man or a woman that you will win election. It is the leadership quality of an individual which is responsible. And plus, in the Indian context, we have caste, religion and many other factors which contributes to the success. The first central government formed in independent India had one among 20 cabinet ministers. So there was only one. The situation has changed. Today we have 23 women cabinet minister, and again the number is not very significant. The most important is the quality, and that is also a change from not only assigning health and women and child care department. They are women who are taking in external affairs and education as well. So what are the factors for increase in participation? The first is the liberalization and opening up of the Indian economy, which I have already talked about. The second is the activism or the civil society's contribution to make politics an integral to the women's movement. That is, politics is a mechanism or a mode through which you can achieve empowerment. It is not possible that you can achieve empowerment without the involvement of women. So actually the whole debate on women and politics is very complex, and it requires a lot of discussions, lot of debates. But to have a brief overview of gender and politics, I think the lecture is quite content wise enough. It is very important to try to understand how politics was understood, what are the changes that has taken place, and what is the current scenario. So achievement has been made, but a lot of progress is still required. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much. Dear friends, if you have any kind of feedback for this particular lecture, then mail us at info.cec@nic.in. Of course, we would be meeting again in the future. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.